Hello and welcome to our presentation, The Thing About Grief Is. And we will be your facilitators today for this presentation. So we've got the lovely Michelle from Grief Space, who is the photo on the left hand of the slide in the denim dress. And it looks like you're wearing denim today as well, Michelle. And my name is Kristen and my face is to the right of the slide. So I'm from Thereafter Therapies. So today our presentation will be about grief and the popularised grief models plus some contemporary grief models. And then we will run through some self-care tips, and we each have a gift for you at the end, which we're really looking forward to giving. And a little bit more about your presenters before we jump into this. So Michelle and I have a number of things in common we worked out, other than the fact that, as we've already established, we both have private practices. We're both registered counsellors with a special interest in grief and loss. And we both actually met in our volunteer position at Grief Line. So for those of you who haven't heard, Grief Line is a free nationwide service here in Australia that you can call anytime in regards to grief, loss, and loneliness. So we also have each lost our beautiful sisters. So that draws us to do this work and really gives us a lot of joy in supporting others also navigating their grief. And we both really, really love our coastal lifestyles. We love the beach and we love yoga. So enough about us, and we will jump into our presentation now. So we'll just go to the next slide. So what is grief? Well, the thing about grief is that it's actually a really natural and normal reaction to the experience of a profound loss. So loss can be, look like many different types of loss. So there's a few names that I've put here: ambiguous loss, disenfranchised, cumulative, prolonged, and anticipatory, just to name a few. So I will go into those a little bit more in a moment. So there are multiple types of grief, and these griefs can arise from multiple different circumstances as well. So I've just put a few examples here on the slide. Obviously, there's many, many examples, but it might include, the death of a loved one, a pet, can be the loss of relationships, whether that's friendships or romantic, loss of special items. It could be our big changes in life that we go through, those big life transitions, whether it's moving house or completely, going through retirement, things like that, and the loss of hopes and dreams. And as I said before, there is a whole lot more that could fall under that, but that's just a few examples. It's really, really important here to note as well that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. So a little easy way to remember this is, grief is as unique to us as our fingerprint. You won't be doing it wrong. It's very normal, and we each have our own ways that we navigate grief. So, we will go into now a little bit more on the next slide about the types of grief that I mentioned there, just to give a few examples into that one. Thanks, Michelle. So we'll talk firstly about cumulative grief, which is also known as compounding grief. So there are different terms for these things, so it can make it a bit confusing. But cumulative grief is the experience of multiple losses within a short period of time. So usually, with one loss after the other, it could be the death of a loved one and then a pet, and then you might have to move house. And when it happens so consecutively like that, there's usually little time in between to process each loss one at a time. We'll move to the next one, disenfranchised grief. So disenfranchised grief is a loss that's not validated by society, or perhaps not disclosed or shared with people due to that fear of judgment from others. So, when someone's going through a disenfranchised grief, that can, really have a big impact, because with the lack of being able to mourn publicly and have that support rallied around, the symptoms of grief can really be exacerbated. Some examples of disenfranchised grief might include suicide loss, the loss of a pet, the loss of a relationship that was a secret, or, you know, if you have a loved one sent to prison. They're all just some examples, as I said before. There's many, many different circumstances that would be an example there. And ambiguous grief. So ambiguous grief is typically experienced when a loved one is still physically present, but they're changed in some way or psychologically absent. Some examples here might be those experiencing drug and alcohol addictions, certain mental health disorders, or those with brain injuries, or certain diagnoses such as dementia. We've got the anticipatory grief, which is the response to an impending loss. So typically, some examples might be those faced with a terminal illness. And it's important here also to note the carers and loved ones of those diagnosed with the terminal illness. They too, as well as the person with the illness, can be experiencing the anticipated grief. Although if your pet is not well, you know, family breakdowns and much, much more. And we've got prolonged grief. So this is also known by many other names. The term that we tend to use now is the prolonged grief, but you might have heard other terms such as non-finite grief, chronic sorrow, and living losses. And this experience is usually quite a reoccurring type of grief, and it can be very intense for those who are experiencing this grief. It can impair daily functioning, and the statistics are that usually it affects 1 in 10 in the grieving population. And some examples of those who might experience prolonged grief are, you know, if you've had a very sudden and traumatic loss, and that might include, you know, a suicide, for example, and the loss of immediate family members. So those who might experience losing, say, a parent or a sibling or a child, people who are really, really immediate to you might experience prolonged grief, and those with chronic conditions as well. So I've popped in here just as above before, you know, it's good to think of the carers might be in this as well. So carers of people with chronic conditions can also experience that prolonged grief. Okay, so that just gives a few examples of the different types of grief that can be experienced along the timeline and the different circumstances or examples where that grief might be felt. But just remember, it's very normal and unique to go through this grief, but hopefully that does help anyone watching sort of put a name to what they might be experiencing, or to help understand who someone you love that's going through grief, the type of grief that they might be experiencing. And we will move over to the next slide, and I think that one is Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen, for an awesome introduction to grief. I really wanted to share about the stages of grief theory, because I think it's important to understand the history of this. This is a really widely known approach to understanding grief. Most people have heard of it because it's quite pervasive in society as our general way of understanding grief. It has been for quite some time. So the work that Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did back in the 1960s was so important. She actually spent a lot of time with patients who were diagnosed with terminal illness and going through their end of life and dying process. And her work was actually really pivotal in changing how we look at palliative care these days. Because previously the focus was on medical care, and now we know that we need to support the emotions as well of people who are preparing to die. So yeah, her work was really important. And what she did is she was sitting and listening to people who were preparing to die. She noticed that they were going through distinct and different stages of emotions as they were processing their end of life journey. So these 5 stages, she said, were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So in coming out with this theory, what ended up happening over time was this was adopted as a model to use with grief in general. And it began to be used by all sorts of health professionals and allied practitioners, psychologists. And then it was showing up in the media and movies as well as the way to understand grief. So Dr. Kubler-Ross actually ended up writing follow-up papers and books to try to explain that the model wasn't meant to be used in a linear way. She knew that people didn't move through the stages of grief one after the other in a linear way. So in thinking about why this model was sort of adopted into grief theory, I think that because grief can be so complex and messy at times, and overwhelming, it's almost like we really wanted to structure it in some way by putting grief kind of into a framework. Perhaps that was giving people guidance as to how to get through grief. So perhaps that's a little bit of an understanding as to why this model became as popular as it was. But there are many issues with using this stage theory to understand grief. So I'll go over 4 of the issues with this model. Firstly, grief doesn't actually follow a set of stages. As Kristen was explaining, it's a very unique experience, and everyone will experience grief differently. So while it might have been convenient to try to package it up into a stage approach, grief doesn't actually work this way. Another issue with this theory is that it normalizes certain emotions over others. So let's take the stage of anger, for example. If someone is feeling anger in their grief, then whoever's supporting them, whether that's a friend or a therapist who's using this perspective, might think, great, okay, anger is one of the stages of grief. That's perfectly understandable. That's in the model. And once they finish processing their anger, they'll probably move on to one of the other stages. So what happens when someone's experiencing a different emotion that's not listed in the model? So let's say their overwhelming emotion is a sense of guilt or relief, or they feel numb. That's not in the model. So the stage theory doesn't normalize these emotions. But the thing about grief is it is a really personal experience. So whatever the person is feeling, that is normal for them. Your feelings are valid and understandable, even if they don't fit into the model. So another issue that we have with stage theory is that it can kind of oversimplify the grief process. It really does focus on the emotions. Actually, the experience of grief can be quite physical for some people. So many people experience disturbances with their sleep or their appetite or digestive issues or pain in the body and things like that. So it can be a really physical response. Many people have a real cognitive response to grief. So they're struggling with confusion and some brain fog and difficulty concentrating and things like that. So grief isn't just an emotional experience, it can be a full body experience. Also, there's a lot of nuance and complexity with grief. So how someone feels can depend on how the person they love died, their relationship with the person. And of course, as Kristen outlined, there's so many different types of grief. So, whilst there might be bereavement when a person dies, that can also come with a range of different secondary losses. So, these are losses that follow on from the person dying. So, there might be a loss of hopes and dreams, a loss of income. If someone loses their partner, they can lose shared parenting relationships and so on. So I think the stage theory of grief doesn't really make space for the complexity of grief and oversimplifies it in this way. With regards to acceptance, well, acceptance has kind of always been listed as the final stage. And this led a lot of people to believe that there was like a goal of a grief process to move through the different stages and eventually reach a final stage of acceptance. But the concept of acceptance can be really problematic when it comes to grief. It kind of gives the impression that we need to be okay with what happened and accept the loss. Perhaps as something that is okay or meant to be. And pressuring people to accept their loss can be unrealistic. And it can also come across as quite offensive, depending on the magnitude of that person's loss. So many people are not going to feel anything that resembles acceptance when it comes to their loss. So I don't think we should be positioning acceptance as the goal, as a final point to reach. So I have spent a bit of time going through this theory just because it's so important to understand where it's come from, as it's still the most widely known theory of grief today. You'll actually see this portrayed in movies and the media, even in some grief education programs. There's also some educational institutions which still teach this to practitioners. It's still in the curriculum. So it's still out there. We argue that it isn't helpful to understanding grief and that it doesn't provide any sense of guidance as to how we can actually support people going through grief. So whether that's a friend you're supporting or in a grief counselling setting. So let's move on to discussing more contemporary understandings of grief. We now understand how unique and individual the grief experience is for different people, because people can experience a wide range of emotions and also the physical and cognitive impacts that I discussed too. So our focus now with grief is on helping people move forward with their grief instead of trying to help them move on from it. We aren't trying to take people's grief away from them. We want to support them through their experience of grief, however that's presenting for them. And then this can change over time. We know that different cultures and generations approach grief differently. Sometimes there can be pressure from family to move on and let go. Many people are uncomfortable around grief and discussing loss. They don't know what to say or do. And so one approach people take in order to cope with this discomfort is to just not talk about the person who died. However, contemporary understandings of grief focus on helping us continue our connection with the person who died and maintaining that bond and working out how to incorporate their legacy and their memory into our life moving forward. So I think in our society, the way we educate around grief and the way we support people with grief is starting to change, particularly with the influence of social media and online support groups and just having access to a wide range of approaches and support tools. And while we don't have time today to discuss all the contemporary approaches to grief, we've chosen two that Kristen and I feel are really helpful and valuable to share about. So I'll hand over to Kristen to share about the first of these models.
Thanks, Michelle, for your wonderful explanation. So like Michelle just said, we're going to talk about one of the contemporary grief models that we do find to be a little bit more accurate than stage theory. And it's called the dual process model. That's very counsellor jargon. So for those of you watching, I'll give an analogy in a minute that might be a bit more helpful way to think about it. But firstly, I just want to share, Michelle and I do talk to grievers quite a lot, and I'm not sure if maybe Michelle has heard these things said as well. Quite often a griever will say, oh, I've just been trying to keep busy and finding a distraction. Is that okay? What do you think about that? Or, other people will say that people have told them, there's a lot of platitudes out there. Some advice to grievers is, not really asked for or helpful. Other advice might be, I'm not sure, it's unique to the situation, but another common term out there that you might have heard is, you need to feel it to heal it. I've put these in inverted commas because they're just things that I have heard being said before. But I think they do pertain a little bit to both sides of the dual process model in grief. So you need to feel it to heal it is, sort of pertaining to the left-hand side there that you'll see on the graph in blue in the loss orientated. So, that is things like leaning into grief, which might be, they've given some examples there, workbooks. So that could even be journaling and writing about your grief experience, making memory boxes, anything sort of, about your loss that you're leaning into. That might be attending support groups or seeing a grief counsellor, or just simply thinking about the thing that you're grieving about or the person that you're grieving about, focusing on the old memories that you had that were really important and special. And on the other side of the table in the purple on the graph there is the restoration orientated side. So that is, that's where that little platitude comes in of keeping busy or feeling that we need to keep busy. But that might include a lot of different things. That looks different for everybody. For some people, that's just watching Netflix, watching a favourite show for a couple of hours. It's doing new things. That could even include old things like hobbies that you might have used to enjoy that you're taking back up again, or finding new hobbies. That might be, a pottery class that you've always wanted to join. And within that, other things will come in, like that's listed there on the right-hand side in the restoration orientated, such as you might form some new friendships through that new social group. So all sort of things that is taking a break from loss, however that looks like to you. It might be taking a holiday. They've even got there figuring out your new life role, like figuring out your new normal. In the middle there, so I've put here grief is like ping pong. So if you think of the dual process model more like a ping pong table, so on one hand side, you've got the loss orientated, and then on the other side, you've got the restoration orientated. So it's both feeling into your loss and then bouncing back over to taking breaks from it. And in the middle of the ping pong table is always the net or the line, and that is what we call everyday life. So again, that looks different for everyone. It might be parenting, cleaning the house even, going to work, doing the grocery shopping, all of the things that we just have to do in everyday life. And the idea is that you're not the table, you are the ball, and it's just your job to try to find a balance that works for you, where you're ping-ponging and moving between each of those things. Again, like we've said the whole way throughout this presentation so far, grief is such a unique experience. So, there's not a set thing here. Like, it's not spend this much time on this side of the table and this much time on the other. That is something that we each, if we tune into our own values and what resonates with us, and we'll sort of just find a flow there. I think it's important to note too, though, that when you're experiencing early loss, like at the very beginning of loss, it is quite normal to be focused in the loss-orientated side of the table. And eventually grief ebbs and flows, just like the ocean and the tides. And over time, that will change. You'll begin to ebb and flow and find a bit more of a balance between the two, both leaning into loss and taking breaks from it. And I think it's just important too to maybe just remember, just don't live in either space. They're both a part of a whole puzzle. So we need all the pieces. So, taking breaks is important, but we would never live in that space where we're not addressing our grief at all. But then we wouldn't live in our grief all the time either. So it's just about taking breaks and moving between the two. And I've put here as well, that the activities are unique to us. Like I did mention when we were talking about the restoration orientated side of the table. If you're not someone that likes pottery, don't do pottery. Find what suits you, and and you'll find a balance as you go along, and just trust your intuition there. So hopefully that model has been helpful to think of, the ping pong table, and just keep moving between the two. So I'll hand over to the next slide now. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. I love the way you explain that, and I love that model. And I know you love this model too. This is the idea of growing around our grief, not trying to get rid of our grief, but remembering that it's a normal human experience that we go through after loss. So we're not trying to forget about it or move on. Our life ends up growing around our grief. So this little image here shows the grief as the little purple teardrop. And as time passes, we end up adding more layers to our life, but we continue to carry the grief with us. We learn how to live with our grief and adapt to it. So in the early days of grief, you might ask, when is my grief not going to feel as hard to cope with as it is right now? It might be overwhelming every minute of your day in the beginning. And since you're in that much pain, you might wonder how you're going to go on to find joy and contentment in your life moving forwards. But over time, you will find ways to adapt to your grief. This is going to be more challenging for some people, particularly I'd say if there are underlying mental health conditions. And this is going to be less challenging for other people, particularly if they're able to open up to receiving support, whether that's through their close circle or their community, or by going to therapy of some kind. So one of the pivotal writers in relation to this approach is Lois Tonkin. She developed this model in 1996, and she was a grief counsellor and a grief educator who developed this model after working with her clients. The idea for the model came from one of her clients who had lost a child years earlier. And this client was describing how her grief used to feel so large that it filled up all the space in her life. And she was reflecting on, over time, how her life ended up becoming larger than her grief and grew around her grief. So I love this model, and I find many people can resonate with it when they learn about it. It's kind of a description of how many people do experience grief, so it's quite relatable in that way. I find it helpful for people who are in the early days of grief, so that they can have hope that their grief isn't always going to be all-consuming. And I think it's also helpful for people who are looking back at how their grief has changed over time, just to know that this is normal and it's perfectly okay for your life to end up expanding beyond the grief. And so this is about embracing the growth that comes in your life after grief. People end up entering new relationships. They'll reconnect with old and new hobbies. They'll make new memories. They might go on a holiday, change their career. And some people end up bringing in new rituals into their life that honour the memory of what or who they've lost. So ideally, we're trying to achieve a balance between our personal growth and also still making space to honour our grief. and we can create personal meaning out of our loss and embrace a sense of hope and empowerment. So I think that just knowing that we can and will grow around our grief can bring that much needed hope. I'll pass over to you, Kristen, to share about how we can look after ourselves during grief.
It's very important that we do. Thanks for explaining. So I've just put a few tips here. Again, before I read through them, it's important to note that, as we've said through the whole way as well, it is unique. So if these things don't resonate with you, that's totally okay. Find what does and go with that. So, some tips on coping and caring for yourself through grief and boosting your well-being is friendship and support. So seek comfort from those who leave you feeling that little bit lighter. Art, music, and creativity. So engaging in hobbies, old or new. Moving your body. So any sort of movement or exercise. Again, that word can be scary, and when we're not feeling great, some of these things are the last thing on our mind. But, just anything that resonates with you. If you're not a runner, I wouldn't say go for a run. If you enjoy a walk, go for a walk. That's great. Also, like I said, I know it can be hard to get moving sometimes. So, I love this little mentality that I heard somewhere once, and I try to adopt it myself as well. It's just add one thing. So, although they say 30 minutes of exercise 3 times a week is ideal, if that is too big of a goal and you are going for a 5-minute walk, the next day try to make it a 6-minute walk. Like, just add 1 more minute. When it comes to the next point, nutritious food and hydration, if you're used to your same 2 veggies, add a 3rd veggie. Just add 1 more veggie. Add 1 more color to your plate. So just adopting the just 1 more can be helpful as well, to just adding that little bit more bits of well-being into your routine. Staying hydrated is important. We often forget to do that in grief, and it might seem incredibly basic, but it's huge. So if you are currently grieving, especially in early loss, and you realize you haven't had much water today, please just go and have a big drink of water. These little things really are the big things. Seeking professional support. So, people find support groups really helpful if there's some in your local area, or you could find your own one-on-one grief counsellor, whichever resonates with you. So sleeping can be a really big one that affects us. As Michelle mentioned back at the beginning, grief can affect us in many ways other than emotionally. It can be a whole body experience. So this is why we look at our well-being as a multidimensional thing, because grief affects us multidimensionally. So with sleep, if you're having trouble sleeping, there are a few things out there. I know on my website I've got a little some sleep hints as well. But yeah, there are sleep routines you can try. Again, don't get disheartened if it doesn't work the first night. Routines take time to build. So just try adding in the little things that work, whether it's the herbal tea or the dimming the lights. And just create that sleep routine that works for you. You could keep a sleep diary and sort of track how you're sleeping and go from there. You could also go and see your GP as well if you're having a lot of trouble sleeping. And I put rest in there as well, retreat when you need to. I know that connection was at the top there with friendships and support, but I think it's also important to say that part of our well-being can be just taking a break. Like if you can't attend that party today, that's fine. Take a rest, retreat when you need to. Caring for others and being in service to others, just giving a compliment to someone else, that can really help boost our happy hormones. Engaging in spirituality. I put connection to higher love. I think I chose those words because religion is, again, such a unique field here. There will be a lot of different people watching this. Some will have religious connections, others will be spiritual, some might not have any of those at all, and all is totally okay. We're all so different. It can either challenge current beliefs as well, grief, or it can, make you look into it a bit more if you weren't currently religious or spiritual before your grief. So a number of different avenues can happen there in grief, but leaning into your spirituality or connecting to higher loves or gods can be helpful there. I've also put under that banner, connecting to yourself. So, that could be through yoga, deep breathing, journaling. Under this category as well is where very soon you'll find out from Michelle some supports, some little free gifts that we're giving afterwards in terms of meditation, breathing, and journaling. So stick around to find out more about that shortly. And the last point here is connection to nature. So just being outside in the fresh air is so amazing for our health. It can really help boost the oxygen in our brain and help out all of our happy hormones flood through our body. So yeah, try connecting to nature, try popping outside, see how you go with those tips. Let us know. It will be interesting to hear from you all afterwards too, what might work and resonate with you.
Thanks, Kristen, for all those awesome self-care tips and ideas. Let's explore some of the benefits of grief counselling. Of course, grief counselling isn't the only way to support yourself through grief, but we've both personally witnessed the benefits of grief counselling for our clients, so we really wanted to touch on this briefly. Grief counselling can support you to navigate your loss and explore your personal experience of grief. And this may look different to other people in your circle who are grieving, and that's okay. So the grief counselling space, one-on-one time with your therapist, gives you the opportunity to share your story and process your own personal loss. You'll probably find that not everyone is comfortable discussing grief and loss, but we think it's invaluable for you to have your time and space to share what's happening for you. So what we'll do in grief counselling is we'll also explore some of the coping tools, what works for you and what feels supportive in your life. And we'll support you to develop a sense of meaning around your loss and find within yourself the ability to move forward with your grief. So just as your grief is unique, also your way of carrying your grief forward with you will also be unique to you. I often hear that people don't want to be a burden or feel like they might be a burden on their family and friends. So in grief counselling, you'll receive non-judgmental and skilled support. You can share whatever is on your mind and your heart without worrying about upsetting us, offending us. And this isn't always the case when you're discussing your grief with family and friends. So I'd really encourage you to reach out to one of us if you'd like to see how grief counselling could support you. Okay, so we've listed a few resources for you. Kristen loved the book Winter's Grace by Will Courts. The author lost his son, and his book is written as a letter to anyone who has experienced heartbreaking loss. I love the book It's Okay That You're Not Okay by Megan Devine. She's a psychotherapist. She lost her partner, and it's a great book for anyone who's grieving or supporting someone else through grief. We love the podcast called Good Morning by Sally Douglas and Imogen Khan. Sal and Im both lost their mothers under different circumstances, and they came together to create an awesome podcast with lots of shared stories that people find they relate to, and they have some great guest speakers on too. Another important resource that Kristen and I are very passionate about because we both volunteer with Griefline. Griefline has a website with lots of resources and also the helpline. So that's a free service where you can call 7 days a week and have a conversation with someone who's trained to support you and listen. So I encourage you to use this free service. It is different to grief counselling, but many people find it really valuable and supportive. We mentioned that we've got some free gifts that we'd like to share with you to thank you for being a part of our webinar. Kristen has these beautiful journal prompts that she shares with her community. So if you would like to receive those, just send her a message and she'll send them to you. And I'm offering my grief support meditation. So I'm happy to send that to anyone. Just send me a message. And so I just wanted to share with you how you can get in touch with both of us. Kristen offers sessions on the Gold Coast and also online. I offer sessions on the Sunshine Coast and also online. So please check out our websites and follow us on Instagram, where we share more about grief and grief therapy regularly. Thank you so much for making time to learn more about grief. We hope that what we've shared here today helps you feel supported, connected, and hopeful. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michelle.